Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Kevin, and in today's video I wanted to respond to the problem of evil. The problem of evil is one of the most popular objections raised against the existence of God, and it's also raised against biblical Christianity too. And my goal in this video is to not only respond to the problem of evil, but to convince you guys, my viewers, that the existence of evil actually does not pose any problem with God's existence and the truth of Christianity. In fact, I'm going to make the case later on in this video that the existence of evil constitutes some of the best evidence for the existence of God. So with that said, let's go ahead and get into it. Just real quick, this PowerPoint I've been using in the last few videos, I made a few years ago and I haven't updated it yet. I'm going to be talking about a few points that I don't have slides for, but most of the stuff I'm going to be talking about should be on the slide. So if you see me glancing over and not looking at the camera, it's because I'm looking at my notes to make sure that I cover everything that I want to cover. So the most common version of the problem of evil is as follows. If God is all-loving and all-powerful, then why wouldn't he create a world with no evil? Why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? The thinking here that, God is all-knowing, he's all-powerful, he's all-loving, and all of these good things, and if those are true, then why would he tolerate evil? Why would he create a world with evil in it? A lot of people who are new to thinking about religion may rightfully ask, if God is all these things, why didn't he just create a world with no evil in it? And I do think that's a reasonable question for somebody to ask, but I also think that the more that we think about it and the more you consider the things I'm going to offer in this video, I think it'll quickly become apparent that the existence of evil is not a very good objection raised against God in the first place. So when it comes to talking about the problem of evil, I think we need to distinguish between the emotional problem of evil and the logical problem of evil. Regarding the emotional problem of evil, what I'm getting at there is how we as human beings respond when we witness evil or even when we experience evil. I mean, if we're on the receiving end of an evil act, we will probably respond with righteous indignation or be upset over what happened to us. If we witness something evil happen to someone else, or even a group of people, or see a catastrophic event on the news, we're going to have a wide range of feelings. We're going to feel disgust at whatever happened. And what I'm trying to draw out here is that our emotional response to evil is just that. It's emotional. It's not a logical objection raised against God. It's just how we emotionally respond to the evil that we see in the world. So just another quick note on that, if you happen to have a friend in your life that just lost a loved one or something like that, or maybe you have a friend that lost a child and is mourning, I wouldn't dive into what I'm about to explain, the logical problem of evil. I wouldn't offer them reasons from that perspective while they're in the mourning stage. While they're in the mourning stage, I would just be there for them, as their friend, pray for them, encourage them, and just be there to support them. I wouldn't dive into all these logical reasons and explanations for why this terrible event happened to them until they were out of the mourning stage and had at least healed enough to be able to tackle that conversation and think about it critically and logically without letting too much of their emotions get in the way. And that's not to invalidate their emotions. I'm just trying to point out that it's perfectly normal to have emotions when we think about the problem of evil, and especially when we're on the receiving end of it. That's perfectly okay, but oftentimes emotion can cloud our judgment and make it harder for us to think about something logically. So once a person has mourned and gotten through that stage for the most part, then it might be a little more appropriate to offer reasons for why God would allow evil in the world. And that's really what the logical problem of evil side of things gets at. I think in order to raise this objection against God, the atheist or whoever's raising the objection would have to show that God doesn't have morally sufficient reasons for tolerating the world. Because as long as it's even possible that God would have good reasons for tolerating evil in the world, then there is no logical contradiction between God's inherent goodness and love and kindness and grace and his all power and omniscience and the existence of evil. Those can only be logically in conflict with each other if it's impossible for God to have no good reasons for tolerating, or to have any good reasons for tolerating evil in the world. So as long as it's even possible that he has morally sufficient reasons for tolerating evil in the world, then there is no contradiction between the existence of evil and the existence of God. So if it were me and I were talking with an atheist, I would press that point with them and make them carry the burden of proof. I'd be like, where's your evidence that God doesn't have good reasons for allowing evil in the world? And I certainly think they do bear the burden of proof on that if they're going to be the ones raising the objection in the first place. They're taking on the burden of proof by doing that. So if after you press that point, if they get to a point in the conversation where they're like, okay, well, if he does have reasons for tolerating evil in the world, what would those reasons be? And I've thought of 4 of them that I want to cover here in the video, but before I get into them, I just wanted to state that as far as I know, the Bible does not explicitly list God's reasons for tolerating evil. So I admit that I am just kind of speculating. I don't know if speculating is the word I'm looking for, but I guess I'm speculating on what his possible reasons are. And even if I'm wrong on the reasons I lay out on the table in this video, even if the 4 reasons I'm about to address actually aren't any of God's actual reasons for tolerating evil, that's not a problem, because we don't need to know what his actual reasons are in order for it to be true that he does have reasons for tolerating evil in the world. So with that said, let's get into some of these reasons that I've thought of. You've probably thought of this one already, and that would just be man's free will and God's desire for us to freely choose him. And what I'm getting at here is that God created and actualized a world in which we humans are free creatures. We have the freedom to choose to seek out God and seek fellowship with him, to trust in Jesus or not to. So he created a world where he wanted to give us the choice, because God gets pleasure and joy from people freely choosing to be with him. No different than how you get joy from knowing that your spouse chose to marry you, as opposed to her having to marry you again out of no free will, just she was forced to do it. So in order for God to grant us that free will, he has to tolerate the evil in the world. It's not possible for God to make somebody freely do something. So it would not be possible for God to create a world with no free will and yet at the same time grant us the freedom to trust in him. I don't think that's possible at all. So again, it's not possible to make somebody freely do something. So in order to give us the free choice, he has to create a world that allows for free will, which in turn allows us as human beings to do evil things. So I would say that constitutes a morally sufficient reason for God to tolerate evil in the world. And on another thing on this point, I do like to ask unbelievers and atheists who raise this objection, if God didn't tolerate evil, then where would you and I be? So what I'm getting at there is, if we offer them the free will explanation for why God allows evil in the world, at least in my experience when I've done that, I have gotten some pushback, and not so much a counter argument, but just it's obvious in their body language or their tone of voice that they just don't like that reason. And I usually respond with asking them, what do you want God to do about the evil in the world? And they typically say, I want him to get rid of it. I'm tired of it. I'm like, okay, so if God's going to get rid of all evil tonight at midnight, where would you and I be at 12:01? And what I've noticed is in this conversation, it becomes apparent that they really don't want God to deal with all the evil in the world. They place the bar above themselves, above their own evil, and they only seem to want God to deal with that evil. I mean, they typically say like, I'm a good person, They seem to want to deny that they've ever done anything evil in their lives, and then they place the bar above themselves. So that's partly why I respond with this by asking them, what do you want God to do about it? Because by asking the question, I'm hoping that they'll come to realize that if God were to deal with evil tonight at midnight, he'd wipe out the entire human race. Because we've all done evil, we've all done immoral and wicked things, we've all sinned against him. And when the atheist comes to realize that, if, provided he's an intellectually honest one, then he should see that that he should desire a sense of gratitude for the fact that God is tolerating his evil and hasn't wiped him out yet. So that brings, just checking my notes here. Another morally sufficient reason that God may have for tolerating the evil in the world is that the amount of goodness in the world corresponds to the amount of evil in the world. And what I'm trying to draw out here is that a lot of the goodness that we see in the world is often brought about in response to something evil that has occurred. And I have some examples. In the medical field, we have hospitals that are providing services and care to people, and that's a good thing to do. But that good thing wouldn't be in existence if we didn't get sick requiring that in the first place. I mean, there's people that give a lot of money online on GoFundMe to help cancer patients or family members struggling with cancer. There's people that invest a lot of money to start homeless shelters and to hand out free food and stuff to the poor, and these are all good things, but those good things wouldn't be in existence if we didn't have any poor people to help, if we didn't have people struggling with cancer to help in that way too. And that also, I also want to emphasize that the reason why we have those natural evils like cancer and sicknesses is because we've all sinned against God in the first place, and we're under a curse for that. So we deserve that too, which would, I guess you could also put that in as a morally sufficient reason for tolerating, in this case, natural evil, is God's tolerating it as a means of his own divine justice and judgment on humanity, and that would be a morally sufficient reason for God to tolerate it as well. But anyways, back to the goodness corresponding to the amount of evil. There's other examples I could talk about. In World War II, there were a number of German citizens that would harbor the Jews and protect them from the Nazis, and that is a good thing that occurred in response to a terrible, evil, wicked, efforts by the Nazis to wipe out the Jews. And then you have Schindler. It reminds me of the movie Schindler's List. He was that wealthy German who had a factory, and he, got a lot of the Jews out of the concentration camps to work at his factory. I mean, that's a really good thing to do in response to a very wicked and evil event. And then, I guess the Titanic comes to mind. I guess I would put that in the category of natural evil, since the Titanic crashed into the iceberg. But the Titanic sank, and a lot of people died from that. But since then, that event sparked, a revolutionary change in the shipping industry to make changes to our ships that we make and how we travel by the ocean to make them more safe. So how many potential shipwrecks have not happened because we improved our technology based on the Titanic incident? Now, I'm just kind of thinking out loud here on those things, but hopefully that helps show the point that the amount of goodness in the world corresponds to the amount of evil in the world. So I would say that another reason God may be tolerating evil is because by tolerating evil, he is achieving the maximum goodness possible in a world with free will. Now, I think the maximum goodness in our world, let me rephrase. What I'm trying to say there is that I think it could be the case that in God's omniscience, he knew if he was going to create a world with free will, and there were possible versions of this, he knew which world would have the maximum goodness alongside us having free will, and that's why he created and actualized the world that we actually have, and tolerates evil in that world because it results in the maximum goodness possible. I don't know if that made sense. I'm doing my best to draw out my thoughts there, but regarding this point, I think the person who scoffs at this would then have to show that the same degree of goodness would be possible. The same degree of goodness involving a world with free moral agents would be possible in a world with less evil or no evil at all. I mean, how could the atheist possibly show that? How could he possibly prove that if our world had less evil or no evil in it, then they would also have the same degree of goodness? I think that's just something he just can't bear the burden of proof for. The next, I don't know if I have a point for this. Yeah, I addressed that already. On this next point, experiencing evil has led many to seek a remedy from the only one who can provide it, God. So what I'm getting at here is when people are experiencing evil, especially for a long period of time, in many cases, it results in them, a desire to seek out the light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, when a lot of people are in a state of suffering, they oftentimes cry out to God and start searching for Him, because even though prior to the suffering they may have rejected God, I think deep down a lot of people recognize that He is the one who can truly get us through a very tough situation. And I think that it could very well be the case that by experiencing evil, that may result in somebody seeking out God, seeking out a remedy for the only one who can provide liberation from the evil that they're going through. And God and Jesus provide that for us. Scripture says that when we're feeling anxious and going through trials, that the peace of God can comfort us. And then ultimately in the next life, we're going to fellowship with Him if we've trusted in Him forever, and be free of pain, suffering, and evil forever in the next life. So by experiencing evil temporarily now in our free world, I really do think that plays a role in drawing people to seek God. Now, that may not be a blanket statement you can apply on all unbelievers, but I do think you can apply it to some of them. And given how much God values us as people, so much so that He would die for us on the cross, and that He loves us, I think that would constitute a morally sufficient reason for God to tolerate evil if He knew that it would play a role in drawing people to Himself. Just 1 second here. I want to check my notes one more time. Oh, yes. This brings me to the fourth reason for why He would possibly tolerate evil. I think it makes total sense for God to allow evil, because by allowing evil and allowing man the free moral agency to commit sins, in turn allows God to give the greatest expression of love and grace ever given on the cross. I'm not sure if allowed was the right term to use there, but what I'm trying to say here is that by tolerating evil, God could then come down in the person of Jesus and not only work miracles around us, but He could offer His own atoning blood on the cross. He could demonstrate His own love for us on the cross by dying for us and offering us grace and a pardon. And that is let me rephrase, nothing else in the world matches the expression of love and grace that God demonstrated for us on the cross. So it could very well be the case by allowing evil and demonstrating that for us on the cross, that in turn is what draws us to seek out God and to seek Jesus. And to a considerable degree, I do think that's actually true. I mean, Scripture says that we are that God draws us, and I think He draws us through the gospel. But the gospel contains the biggest story of grace and compassion and pardoning for human sins if we trust in Jesus. So if we had a world where there was no evil, therefore God didn't have to come down and die for us on the cross in the person of Jesus, then it could very well be the case that we as human beings would not seek out God like how we are in this world. So I think for someone to reject this as a possible reason for God tolerating evil in the world, they would take on the burden of having to show and prove that humans would still seek God without an expression of love and grace given to us on the cross. And I don't know how anyone could possibly show that. I mean, there is no reason to conclude that in a world with no evil, if God just revealed Himself, in a world with no or little evil, that God would reveal himself, that we would still seek fellowship with him. I mean, we have no reason to think that that is true. So again, I think by demonstrating his love and grace for us on the cross is one of the biggest pieces of the equation that draws us to seek out fellowship with God and to trust in Jesus. And he wouldn't need to make that expression if there was no evil, and in turn there wouldn't be something to draw us to seek fellowship with him. So those are just some reasons I've offered for why God would tolerate evil in the world, but I do want to cover a few more. I want to cover a couple of other objections that relate to the problem of evil. So before I get into that, sorry, I got ahead of myself. I wanted to point out that I think evil constitutes some of the best evidence for the existence of God. And I first learned of this point from C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis was a very well-known Christian apologist, but before he became a believer, he was at one point a very, very staunch atheist. He rejected the existence of God. And by the way, sorry, my nose, I don't know what it is. When I record videos, my nose just really itches. But anyways, C.S. Lewis used to be a very, very staunch atheist, and he rejected God because of the evil in the world. But then it eventually occurred to him that on atheism, what standard does he have to categorize good and evil? On what basis can he call something evil and call something else good if there is no perfect standard of goodness grounded in God's character to refer to? And in his book, I think he says this in Mere Christianity, he said, how could he identify what a crooked line is if he didn't first have a straight line to compare it to? And I think the same idea applies to morality. Atheists have no they have no justification for their claims of certain things being evil without a perfect standard of goodness to refer to. A standard above ourselves, as I pointed out in my last video on the video I did on objective moral values and duties and grounding that in God. I show that God is the foundation and grounding for objective moral values. He's the standard of right and wrong. So if you take him out of the picture, then we have no basis to categorize certain behaviors as evil and other behaviors as good, because that requires a standard for us to refer to justify the claim. So what I'm getting at here is, in order to be meaningful, the category evil requires God's existence. An objective standard rooted in God's character is required in order to give evil meaning. So if God does not exist, then things like murder can't be inherently wrong. On a naturalistic worldview, or at least a worldview that doesn't have God in it, we don't have any way to justify the claim that things like murder and rape are evil. We may not like murder and rape, but at best that would just be a preference. God is required in order to justify that those things are wrong. And I've had conversations with atheists all the time on this, where they bring up terrible events like the Holocaust, and even sometimes they'll bring up how God wiped out the Canaanites, and they accuse God of all these of genocide and all other moral atrocious things. And I ask them, I say, hey, what's wrong with wiping out an entire people if there is no God? Why is that wrong without God? Why is it wrong to murder if there is no God? And they respond, because you're killing an innocent person. I'm like, okay, why is it wrong to kill an innocent person? Because then humanity doesn't survive and thrive as a species. All right, why is it good for us to thrive and survive as a species? And you keep doing this over and over again, and if they stick with you without getting angry and name-calling you, they should see that they're borrowing moral principles from God without any way of grounding them. I agree with them that murder is wrong and things like that, but that claim has no grounding unless there's a moral lawgiver that we can refer to justify the claim. And they might say, oh, well, it's wrong because society says wrong. I'm like, okay, well, some societies say it's okay to gay bash. Other societies thought it was okay to behead homosexuals. Why are they wrong? And then we're back to addressing who the authoritative foundation is for morality. So a quick note on the Canaanites thing that I mentioned. I do plan on doing separate videos on those subjects and showing that in the case of the Canaanites, they were engaged in wicked behavior. God gave them every opportunity to stop it, and they didn't, and he executed his divine judgment on them. And virtually every example in the Old Testament where God wipes out a people, he's justified in doing so. In fact, as I'm going to cover more in those videos, it's not possible for God to murder because he's the giver of life and he can take it back whenever he wants. But even with that said, in all of these examples where God had people wiped out, they were engaged in wicked behavior and afforded a chance to stop and repent, and they didn't do it. And in the cases where they did, where they were warned and they did repent, like with Jonah and Nineveh, he didn't wipe them out. So I'll cover that in more detail in another video. But anyways, to get back to what I'm trying to get at here is evil constitutes some of the best evidence for the existence of God because his perfect standard is required in order to categorize things as good or evil. And I also can't help but notice an inconsistency on the atheists' behalf. On the one hand, they're complaining that God tolerates evil in the world. And then on the other hand, they get mad when he doesn't tolerate it and he wipes entire peoples out. So which is it? Do they want them to deal with evil or not? They can't seem to make up their minds on that subject. So that brings me to another topic I wanted to address underneath the problem of evil umbrella, and that is the question of why would God create someone who he knows in advance will end up in hell? I've heard this question a lot, and I do think there's a good answer to it. It is a little philosophically technical, so try to bear with me here. So in 1 Timothy 2:4, it tells us that God desires the maximum number of people to freely choose him. And I want to emphasize the word maximum here. It really says that God desires for everybody to choose him, and he wants the most number of people in the world possible to do that. So it could very well be the case that if God created a world in which there was no evil, then maybe only 2 or 3 people would come to seek him. So I think the atheist would have to show that in a world with little to no evil, the same number of people would choose to have fellowship with God, and I don't think he can bear the burden of proof for that. So again, I think God creates a world where he knows people will reject him, and he allows for that in order to secure the maximum number of people who will freely choose him. So creating a world where everyone chooses him may not be desirable for him because such a world may only have 3 people in it. That's really what I'm trying to say. If you add any more than that, then you're destined to get people that won't choose him, and then that maximum number that he knows out of his omniscience will never get reached. So God is so loving that he won't force anyone into his presence against their will. And I kind of mentioned this with the marriage example earlier, but think about an example I want to give to kind of emphasize this point is think about a man who is really interested in the woman, and the woman tells him, "I only like you as a friend." Now, if the man truly loved her, he'd respect her decision and let her go. But would it be loving for the man to respond with, "You know what? I love you so much, I'm going to force you to marry me"? I don't think so. If he really loved her, he would let her go, and I think God is operating in a similar way. He loves us so much that he won't force us into his presence against our free will. But if we choose to reject him, then we're also choosing to embrace the judgment and punishment that we deserve for our own sins. God's not obligated to save us. He could send all of us to hell right now, and he would be completely justified in doing so because we've all sinned against him. But he's offered us a pardon and he's offered us grace, but it has to be on his terms. And to be honest, his terms aren't even steep. His terms are trust in Jesus and recognize what I did for you on the cross, essentially. So I don't think God is being unreasonable at all, and I'm very grateful for the fact that he's given us free will and afforded me the choice to freely choose him. Another objection raised against Christianity as it relates to the problem of evil that I want to address is The objection of the unevangelized. What happens to those who never hear the gospel when they die? And I don't have slides for this. The slideshow I'm using for this video needs to be updated, and I haven't updated it yet. But I still want to address this objection. What happens to those who never hear the gospel? And the objection basically says, like, hey, God is all loving and he's merciful, gracious, and he's supposed to be fair, right? Well, how is he being fair to those who never hear the gospel? They die and then they get sent to hell for their sins because they never had a chance to trust in Jesus. How is that fair? And I have a couple things I want to say to this. Well, more than a couple. I think I have about 3 things I want to say to this. Number one is I agree with them in one sense that God is not being fair. But I mean that in a different way than they probably do. If God were being fair, he would send all of us to hell right now because that's what we deserve. We've all sinned against him and we deserve to go to hell. That's fair, giving us the just punishment for sinning against him. That's what we deserve. But instead of being fair with us in that sense, he's chosen to show us grace and mercy and to offer us a pardon for our sins and to die for us on the cross. So in one sense, that's not being fair. That's being merciful. The second thing I want to say is God sets the terms. He doesn't have to save us. He's not obligated to save us, and he is completely justified to set the term of requiring us to trust in Jesus, recognize Jesus' deity, and to trust in what he did for us on the cross. And to be honest, those terms aren't even steep to begin with. I'd say we have it pretty easy compared to what we deserve. Now, that's still, I guess, with those things in mind, that leaves the question on the table, like how do we make sense of God creating somebody who he knows will never hear the gospel? How do we make sense of that? And I think this is where a feature of God's omniscience needs to be laid on the table, and that is God's middle knowledge. So this may be a term that's new for you. I'm not aware of very many churches that are teaching about God's middle knowledge, and I first learned about God's middle knowledge from William Lane Craig. So what is God's middle knowledge? Well, we know that God is all-knowing. That means he knows everything that has occurred in the past. He knows everything that is occurring in the present right now. He knows everything that will occur in the future, but he also knows everything that did not occur but would have occurred if other conditions had been met. And that is known as a counterfactual. That's what philosophers call a counterfactual. So again, a counterfactual is something that didn't occur but would have occurred if other circumstances were met and other conditions were met, whereas a factual is something that did occur or that will occur in the future. So hopefully the difference between a factual and a counterfactual made sense there. And I think we find evidence of God's middle knowledge of all counterfactuals in Scripture. I'm reminded of the passage where Jesus says, if these works would have been done in Sodom and some other cities, they would have repented a long time ago. Well, see, now he's giving us a piece of his middle knowledge. He's telling us something that didn't occur, but would have occurred if other circumstances had been met and in play. So God certainly does have middle knowledge. He knows all counterfactuals, and not only that, but he knows all factuals and counterfactuals in all possible worlds. And if I didn't state this already in the video, a possible world is basically a fancy way of saying the way the world could have been. When God chose to create the universe, he had a large number of possible worlds that he could have chosen to create and actualize. So a possible world is just one of those worlds that he could have created, and whereas the actual world is ours. It's the actual world that he did choose to create and actualize. So God knows all counterfactuals, he knows all factuals, and he knows these in all possible worlds. So with that in mind, I think at the moment of creation, God he already knew in his mind a complete list of everybody that would choose to trust in him, and he had a complete list of everybody that he knew would reject him. He already knew what people would do prior to actualizing the world. So knowing that, I think he actualized the world in such a way where those who he knew would respond to the gospel would be created at a time and place where they would accept it. And those who he knew would reject the gospel in all possible worlds, he creates them at a time and place where they will never hear the gospel. And again, that kind of comes back to why would God create someone who he knows will end up in hell? This all kind of plays a role in creating and allowing for the maximum number of people to freely choose him. And the ones who he knew would reject him and never accept the gospel, he puts them at a time and place to where they'll never hear it. Whereas with those who will respond to the gospel and trust in him, he creates them at a time and place where they will be afforded a chance to hear the gospel. So what I'm trying to get at here is for those who never hear the gospel and die in that condition, when they stand before God and say to him, like, hey, I never had a chance to hear the gospel, God can respond with, you would have rejected me even if you did hear it. In all possible worlds, you would have rejected me. And this is something that I know of my knowledge. You would have never trusted in me even if you did hear the gospel. So I really think that helps kind of make sense of the unevangelized. And I think understanding God's middle knowledge plays a huge part in making sense of that. Now, as much as I like William Lane Craig, I have a tremendous amount of respect for him and his work. He's one of my favorite Christian apologists. I watched a video, I can't remember if it was one of his public debates or if he was just doing a Q&A, but somebody asked him, what happens to those who never hear the gospel? And William Lane Craig responded with basically saying, and I'm paraphrasing here, he basically told them that the people who never hear the gospel will be judged based on the limited knowledge of God that they do have and what they've done with the limited knowledge that they've been of God that they've been given, like creation and observing the universe and concluding that it was created and that God exists and so forth. Craig has suggested that they'll be judged on that knowledge, and I don't think that is biblically correct, because in John 3:16 and 18, in fact, if you were to just read John 3:16 through verse 18, you'll see that it says that God so loves the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. It's the most quoted verse of the New Testament, arguably the most quoted verse anyways. And people read verse 16 a lot, but they seem to stop there. They don't read verse 18, which says that those who don't believe are condemned already because they have not believed in his only Son. And the word believe in the Greek more accurately translates trust. A Christian faith is trusting in Jesus for the atonement of our sins. And the reason why people are condemned already is because we've all sinned against God. We've all sinned against him. We're deserving of eternal punishment in hell. We've sinned against the perfect, eminently holy being of the universe, and we are guilty. We're condemned already. And Jesus was very, very clear that he is the only way to heaven. He is the only means of atonement. It's only by the blood of Jesus can we be atoned and pardoned. And he is the only way, it's trusting in him that allows for us to fellowship with God and to get into heaven someday. And Jesus was very clear that he is the only way. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because if what Craig has suggested is true, then Jesus is not the only way. There would be another way, namely just being ignorant of the gospel and having a basic belief in God can also result in you being saved. But I think that conflicts with what Jesus taught. Jesus seemed to think that he was the only way, no exceptions. The sole exclusive way to salvation is through him. Jesus was clear on that. So if Craig is correct in saying that a person can become saved just based on their limited knowledge of God and just having a general trust in God in that sense, then that would mean that ignorance of the gospel would constitute another way that someone can become saved. And furthermore, if what Craig is saying is true, then we should stop all missions right now indefinitely and stop trying to share the gospel with people, because there could be people out there that at this moment have a general belief in God but have never heard the gospel. And if we share the gospel with them, now they're going to reject it and they're not going to be saved anymore, because according to Craig, they can become saved just by a general belief in God because of their limited, the limited amount of revelation to them through creation and so forth. I don't know if that made sense. I'm trying my best to articulate it. I'm just trying to say that if Craig's view is true, then we should stop sharing the gospel with people, because by doing that, by sharing the gospel, we run the risk of that person hearing it and rejecting it, and now they're no longer saved. So I don't think Craig's view is reasonable, and I don't think it's consistent with what Jesus taught. But with that said, I hope understanding that God has middle knowledge and he knows in advance who will accept them and who will reject them, I hope that helps clear up in your mind why God is not in the wrong for creating people who will never be afforded a chance to hear the gospel, because it could very well be the case that he already knew that they would reject him even if they did hear it in all possible worlds. And again, God sets the terms. He's the one that sets the conditions that has to be met for us to be saved. He's the one that even affords us the chance to be saved in the first place. He doesn't have to do that. And instead of being fair, I'm very grateful that he's showing us grace and mercy and has offered us a pardon. The last point I wanted to cover is, why would God create the devil if he knew in advance that the devil would be responsible for so much evil in the world? And I think the same basic principle applies here. This objection presupposes that God doesn't have good reasons for tolerating the devil's existence. And the atheist would have to provide evidence or reasons to show that it's not possible for God to have good reasons to tolerate the devil's existence. So again, they might ask, well, why would he tolerate the devil? The devil's, the father of lies. He's responsible for so much evil in the world, and God would have known this ahead of time, so why would he create the devil? And again, I'm speculating here, but one reason I thought of is that, what if the devil's schemes and activity is actually contributing to the maximum number of people coming to seek Jesus? I think that could very well be the case, because in the New Testament, Jesus casted out demons a number of times, and so did the apostles. And there were people to see this. There were bystanders standing around that saw Jesus cast out demons, that saw the apostles cast out demons. And by seeing this, they made the choice to trust in Jesus. So it's really ironic, because the devil's trying to keep people from turning to Christ, but his own efforts are resulting in the opposite. His own efforts of possessing people, with the power of his demons, and then seeing his demons get cast out is contributing to people seeing this and being convinced that Jesus is God and trusting in him. So it just I think that just clues us into just how wonderful God's knowledge is. He knew this would happen. So it's kind of a big fat slap in the face, in Satan's face. It's as if God were saying, yeah, you're going to try to turn people away from me, and in your efforts, you're going to help them seek me. So I don't know. That's just something I've thought of, and I think that would help give us an idea of some good reasons God would have for tolerating the devil's existence. So that pretty much covers all of the points that I wanted to hit on in this video. And I hope, if you've made it this far, I hope it's become apparent that the reason why God has evil in the world is most probably due to the fact that he has good reasons for tolerating it. I really think that's the case. As long as it's possible that God has good reasons for tolerating evil in the world, then there is no conflict between the existence of evil and the existence of God. There is no contradiction there, because he has good reasons to tolerate it, and evil constitutes some of the best evidence for the existence of God.